1991, the young Olivia Burnett in The Torkelsons.
Man in the moon, tonight I'm a young woman filled with anxiety.
When The Torkelsons was on, debuted in 1991, I had just started college. I was commuting at the time, and so I was driving back and forth a lot and only saw a little bit of it here and there. I remember thinking that it was very funny because Olivia Burnett's character was so dramatic. So I came across The Torkelsons on YouTube for free and decided I would binge it. Now, here's the catch with The Torkelsons. The Torkelsons lasted one season, or two, depending on your perspective. In the second season, they rebranded it. They changed the setup, the situation involved. They dropped two of the kids and pretended that they had never existed. They moved to another place, and it became the TV show Almost Home. Full disclosure, I never saw any of it at that point, and I have not begun that season yet. I literally finished The Torkelsons this morning ahead of videotaping this. I'm showing my age, recording this. They are very different from one another, from what I can gather, and because I had not seen the second part yet. But the name change, the character being, two of them being dropped, it sort of, is it a reboot, like a reimagining? We would say today, is it Torkelsons in another universe? But because they are going to be markedly different, I thought I'm going to do a review on just The Torkelsons as the one season series that exists under that title. And I will watch the other one and see how I like it, and maybe I will review that as a separate thing. What really makes The Torkelsons entertaining, and it's a shame that it didn't do better or last longer, it really is a sitcom that sort of bridged the gap. It exists in the era of Married with Children, for example. The era where things like Roseanne, which was a ripoff of Married with Children, don't get me started on that, bringing more of the crude and obnoxious sort of humor into the mainstream. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Married with Children. Those people are hilarious, but it was very different than, say, the era before with Family Ties and Full House and God forbid, The Cosby Show, which were very wholesome. There was some humor, but there were very heartwarming sort of family stories. The Torkelsons is not Married with Children, but it is also not Family Ties. It is a broken home. The father is gone. When he does return a couple times, he's a rat, and there's some poignant things that take place. It's very heartfelt, very heartwarming moments, all of that sort of family quality with a lesson stuff of an earlier era. But it's hard to define an example, but the humor and the way they interact was sort of a step closer to the 90s, being in the 90s, than any of those 80s sort of family sitcoms. So it doesn't come across as, if you're living in this jaded age now, it's hard to go back and watch some of those completely wholesome family sitcoms of the 80s. The Torkelsons, on the other hand, does not feel quite like that. So it was quite entertaining and enjoyable, and yet it never crosses the line into being too modern. And maybe that was the thing that kept it from being a bigger hit at the time, that people didn't feel like where it was going, trying to be, and were looking for more things like Roseanne and Married with Children. But the show is really well done. The characters are really well done. The kids do a great job. And I usually mention a few things about the names of the stars when I'm starting a review, and I might get away from that. And this is a good example. That's a whole ensemble cast. There's so many people in the Torkelsons and so many guest stars. And I don't know, I was thinking, is this something that changed with the streaming service, different companies making different stuff in different places era? But when you look at a show like The Torkelsons at that time, almost everybody's familiar. There's the mother-in-law was on Star Trek. The mother-in-law, she was on a ton of other things. The house boarder Hodges is actually from the original Star Trek way back in the day, The Trouble with Tribbles. But even the kids, Omri Katz, who was on Dallas as John Ross, and then was on this show as a guest, and then would be on the reunion movies of Dallas. There's literally too many people to mention. I think there's a Mighty Morphin Power Ranger that appears. I think I saw that in the credits later on, watching something related to the show, but it wasn't a show that I watched. It was childish after my era. So there's a whole ton of people in here that make it interesting. But the two key components that really make the Torkelsons great, the writing does this good job of being very poignant and tugging at your heartstrings and wholesome in places, and still being funny enough, surprisingly funny enough, that I laughed out loud a lot of times, which is something I generally don't do now if I go back and look at old Family Ties episodes or God forbid, The Cosby Show. I can't believe I ever watched that. It was so goofy, but we did. The Torkelsons had a really good quality of humor, and the interaction between, even with all of those kids, they just did an excellent job. But the other thing, and probably the major thing, Olivia Burnett's character, she's the one that really stands out. It's more or less, you feel like the show is about her and then the environment around her, because it tends to begin with her and end with her, especially her discussions with the man in the moon, which is an interesting sort of shtick. But what's fascinating is we see the world through her character, Dorothy Jane Torkelson, and she's an over-dramatic 14-year-old. She's a teenager, and everything's dramatic, and everything's a huge deal, and all of those things that people, by the time you're my age, you find it totally annoying, and you don't ever want to be around teenagers. But somehow she does it in this uniquely intellectual way, because she's always talking about famous writers, Shakespeare and poetry and things she's into. She's over dramatic, but not in a way that makes you angry, not in a way that makes you tired of her. She's over dramatic in a way that is absolutely hilariously entertaining. When you get clips of her sitting at her window saying things like, someday people will walk by here and look up and say, there's where that sweet young girl died of complete boredom. And another will say, she delivers it with this Shakespearean sort of level of drama that actually, it makes it very entertaining, despite the fact that she's just being an overdramatic teenager. And so it comes across as funny and is actually makes it enjoyable to watch. So the Torkelsons, some of them you find on YouTube aren't very clear. Some people were complaining that maybe Disney should put it on Disney Plus and redo it, but I don't pay for Disney Plus. Watching it free on YouTube is fine. Some of them are clearer than others, but it is fun to watch. Look it up. You can find it, The Torkelsons. It's another thing that I will probably watch again one of these days in the future, because it was really well done. And boy, it's really just a shame that there's not more of it, because she did such a good job delivering that. The writing was overall so good, and the dynamic was so good. And again, I feel like it failed because it was a little bit of two different worlds at a transition from one sort of sitcom to another, and didn't quite get enough audience from either. Anyway, The Torkelsons, look it up, find it, watch it, enjoy it. Thanks for being here. Leave me any comments, and we will see you next time.
People say God looks out for the working man.